February 16th, 1943. 19,000 feet above the industrial heart of the Ruhr Valley, Germany. The night air was bitter, carrying a faint metallic tang from the distant factories below. Clouds stretched like low-hanging smoke, partially obscuring the flickering lights of Essen and Dortmund. The wind sliced through the thin cockpit canopy, rattling instruments and making every movement feel heavier than it should. Flight Lieutenant Henry Hank Chambers of No. 57, Squadron Royal Air Force, adjusted his oxygen mask, his fingers stiff from the cold. At 26, he had flown more missions than he cared to count. Yet the first moments over German soil never lost their tension. His mind flickered briefly to his wife, Mary, waiting in Liverpool, knitting socks he knew he'd never wear again. Below him, the city sprawled like a living map of fire and steel. The glow of the factories painted the clouds in shades of orange and red. But it was deceiving. Beautiful, yet lethal. In the dark, the silhouettes of German searchlights pierced the night sky, slicing into the blackness like jagged fingers reaching for the stars. Hank's aircraft, a Vickers Wellington Mach A3, hummed beneath him. Its twin Bristol Pegasus engines vibrated steadily, each propeller a sentinel against the cold. The Wellington was a strange combination of grace and fragility. A flying coffin, the Luftwaffe called it, slow and lumbering compared to the sleek Messerschmitt Bf 110s and Heinkel He 219s that prowled the night. Yet, it carried secrets the enemy could not see. A lethal mixture of defensive gunners, improvised radar countermeasures, and a stubborn resilience that had already claimed several German night fighters. Chambers glanced at his crew. Sergeant Thomas Tommy Hargreaves manning the nose turret, eyes wide behind his goggles. Flight Sergeant Samuel Sam Dawes leaning over the dorsal turret, scanning the black expanse for glimmers of enemy searchlights. And Warrant Officer Lionel Grant, the navigator, whispering coordinates into the cramped cabin over the roar of engines. Every man was alert, muscles tight with anticipation, every breath visible in the freezing cockpit. The briefing had been clear. Ruhr Valley, high-value industrial targets, and avoid the Luftwaffe night fighters at all costs. But the Germans had been overconfident. Their pilots, dismissive of the slow Wellingtons, had laughed when the RAF began nighttime bombing raids. Easy prey, one Luftwaffe ace had bragged. But in the last few weeks, something strange had begun. Night after night, German interceptors had exploded midair, torn apart without warning. No tracer fire, no rockets, no bomber damage. Just violent, inexplicable destruction. Hank tapped the intercom. "Eyes up, lads. The fun starts now." From below, a faint pulse of light flickered on the horizon. The first searchlight beams converging on the approaching bombers. The night was alive with unseen dangers. But the Wellington held steady, a lumbering ghost gliding into the maw of the Reich. Engines roared. Turrets clicked. Each man's heartbeat echoed louder than the sound of gunfire that was yet to come. The air was electric. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, the first German night fighters waited, confident, lethal, and about to discover that this seemingly slow bomber was far deadlier than its reputation suggested. February 16th, 1943. 9,500 feet. The Ruhr lay spread beneath the Wellington like a sleeping giant, unaware of the deadly choreography above. Hank's eyes scanned the darkness ahead, straining to detect even the faintest glimmer of movement. The night was deceptively calm, but the shadows between the clouds promised chaos. Suddenly, a flicker, a thin streak of light arced across the horizon, vanishing into the blackness. Hargreaves stiffened in his turret. "Messerschmitt," he whispered, voice tight. The Bf 110 had spotted them, its radar humming faintly in the distance. The Germans believed the Wellingtons were easy prey, slow and cumbersome. Tonight, that arrogance would be their undoing. The first night fighter dived from above, its twin engines a shrill scream cutting through the night. Hank's hands gripped the control column as the Wellington pitched slightly under evasive maneuvers. The bombers shuddered as flak burst nearby, metal fragments rattling along the fuselage. Each explosion lit the night in a brief, ghostly flare, shadows of the crew's tense faces flickering across the cramped interior. Dawes leaned into the dorsal turret, tracking the incoming fighter. "On your 6 o'clock, sir." His voice was calm, precise, a beacon in the chaos. Hargreaves rotated the nose turret, bracing against the cold metal. The Wellington's .303 Browning guns chattered into the night. Sparks erupted around the enemy aircraft as rounds ripped through its fuselage. The German pilot twisted and spun, desperate to avoid the hail of fire, but suddenly, a violent flash erupted along its wing. The night fighter shuddered violently, its canopy exploding inward in a shower of glass and fire. The aircraft spiraled out of control, falling like a star shot from the sky. Hank felt a surge of disbelief mixed with grim satisfaction. No tracer fire from the Wellington had even touched the cockpit directly. This was the strange phenomenon that had baffled the Luftwaffe. Electronic countermeasures, small bombs of radio jamming, and improvised equipment aboard the Wellingtons had disrupted the German planes' engines, sent their weapons into fatal misfires, and caused catastrophic structural failures midair. Another Bf 110 closed in from starboard, confident, calculating. But tonight, the RAF bomber was no easy mark. Hank ordered a shallow dive, descending into a low cloud bank. The enemy followed, vanishing into the darkness. The crew held their breath. Outside, the night seemed to pulse with anticipation. Then, a distant, sudden explosion illuminated the clouds. A second German fighter torn apart in midair, debris scattering like fireworks over the Ruhr. Chambers exhaled slowly. "It's happening again. Keep calm, lads. Eyes sharp." His crew worked in synchronized precision. Each gunner tracked movements, anticipating attacks, relying not just on reflex, but on an almost mystical understanding of the bomber's new, deadly defenses. They were not just surviving, they were reshaping the rules of engagement. Below them, the factories still glimmered, oblivious to the aerial duel raging above. Each bomber had a purpose, each enemy a lesson in hubris. The Germans had underestimated the Wellingtons, laughed at their slow, awkward frames. Now, the laughter had turned into fear. And the fear was palpable in the cold night air, freezing more than just the fingers of those flying above it. It was freezing confidence, pride, and arrogance itself. February 16th, 1943. 20,000 feet. The night above the Ruhr had grown colder, darker, more merciless. Hank Chambers' Wellington, a lumbering giant of metal and determination, sliced through the black sky with mechanical precision. Each vibration of the Bristol Pegasus engines reverberated through the fuselage, a steady heartbeat amid the chaos of war. Then it happened. From starboard, a Messerschmitt Bf 110 emerged like a predator from the shadows, its twin-engine growl a chilling announcement of imminent danger. Hargreaves swung the nose turret, tracing the enemy's sleek silhouette. The bomber's defensive guns coughed fire. The tracer rounds whipped past the German's fuselage, harmless in appearance, yet unnervingly precise. Suddenly, without warning, the Bf 110 shuddered violently. Sparks erupted from its port engine, flames licking the night sky. The aircraft wobbled, twisted, and then exploded. Fireball and debris tore through the darkness, raining down over the Ruhr's industrial sprawl. The crew's stomachs churned, eyes wide. They had seen night fighters down before, yes, but not like this. Not from nothing they could touch. Dawes's voice was taut over the intercom. "Another one, same as last time. Engine, it just blew." Hank tightened his grip on the control column. Adrenaline surged, but his mind remained razor sharp. He could feel the subtle vibrations in the air. The way the enemy's presence warred with the invisible currents of radar interference and electronic countermeasures installed in their Wellingtons. These planes, slow and underestimated, were now instruments of near-mystical destruction. From above, searchlight beams flickered across the sky, desperate hunting. But too late. The next Bf-110, trusting in speed and firepower, slipped into the trap. As it approached, the aircraft's starboard engine stuttered violently. Then the violent flash. The night fighter erupted, wings torn apart, canopy disintegrating, and the pilot's final scream swallowed by the cold night wind. The crew stared at each other, a mixture of awe, fear, and disbelief on every face. This was no ordinary battle. It was a silent, invisible war waged by electronics, gunners, and sheer ingenuity. Hargreaves's hands shook slightly on the turret, while Sam Dawes muttered, almost to himself, "Flying coffins indeed. But we're ghosts tonight." The wreckage fell in pieces toward the ground, fire and smoke streaking the night. For a brief moment, the Ruhr seemed suspended in disbelief, the factory's furnaces reflecting the sudden pyrotechnic carnage above. Hank exhaled slowly, glancing at the altimeter. They had survived the first wave, but the night was far from over. "Keep tight formation," he ordered. "They'll be back, and the ones who follow, they'll learn exactly why they laughed at us." Each crew member returned to their stations, adrenaline mixing with grim determination. The Wellingtons, the lumbering beasts, had become hunters. The Luftwaffe pilots, arrogant and unprepared, were their prey. And above the Ruhr, the deadly dance continued, a ballet of fire, steel, and fate. February 16th, 1943. 2,500 feet. The Wellington crept through the clouds like a ghost, engines humming a steady, ominous lullaby. The night around them was fractured. Searchlights stabbed upward from the Ruhr below, their beams crisscrossing the sky like pale fingers seeking prey. The city's glow was muted by smoke and frost, a deceptive calm over a deadly battlefield. From above, a shadow shifted. Another Bf-110, or perhaps a Heinkel He-219, emerged from the cloud layer, confident, predatory, unaware of the invisible traps awaiting. Hank's eyes narrowed. He could feel the tension radiating through the fuselage, the air thick with anticipation. Each second stretched into eternity as the enemy drew closer. Dawes adjusted the dorsal turret, scanning with meticulous precision. "They're coming in fast, lining up from 12 o'clock. His voice was steady, though his knuckles whitened on the gun grips. Hargreaves swung the nose turret, fingers brushing against cold metal as the first rounds cut through the night, tracer fire streaking like fiery snakes toward the approaching fighter. The enemy pilot banked sharply, trying to avoid the fire. And then, the familiar, terrifying phenomenon struck again. Sparks flared along the port engine, a grotesque prelude to destruction. Flames licked the fuselage, instruments shattered, and in an instant, the night fighter erupted, a fireball against the clouds. "Another one," shouted Hargreaves. They're just blowing up." Chambers gritted his teeth, pushing the Wellington into a shallow dive to avoid the flak below. Each movement required precision. The bomber was slow, vulnerable, yet somehow unstoppable. He thought of the pilot reports he had read in secret, the Luftwaffe's growing panic as night after night, their best aircraft disintegrated midair without apparent cause. These Wellingtons had turned the hunter into the hunted. Below, the Ruhr's factories glowed like molten metal, oblivious to the spectacle above. Each explosion of a German night fighter cast long shadows over the city, painting the clouds in ghostly orange and black. The crew held their breath as the sky trembled with the shock waves of destruction. Grant, the navigator, whispered over the intercom, "We're almost at the target. Keep steady, lads. Eyes open. One more mistake and it could be us." The Wellington shuddered slightly as it leveled out. Hank's hands tightened on the control stick, muscles rigid, mind racing. Outside, the night was alive with invisible currents. The deadly game of electronics and gunners claiming lives silently, methodically. The Luftwaffe pilots had mocked them for being slow, cumbersome, and exposed. But now, every attempt to intercept was punished with a violent, fiery lesson. A fleeting thought crossed Hank's mind. The world will never believe this. He glanced at his crew, their faces illuminated by intermittent flashes of distant explosions. Fear, determination, and awe mingled in the cramped cockpit. They were witnesses to a new kind of war, one where courage, technology, and unpredictability combined to turn even a lumbering bomber into a legend. February 16th, 1943. 21,000 feet. The Ruhr lay beneath the Wellington like a grid of fire and steel. Factories glimmered faintly through the smoke, their chimneys belching thick clouds that merged with the night sky. The bomber's engines thrummed steadily, carrying the crew closer to their objective. But the tension inside the cockpit was palpable. Hank adjusted his oxygen mask, eyes darting between the altimeter, the map, and the shadows above. "Target ahead," he said, voice steady but taut. The bomb bay doors opened with a metallic groan, and a hiss of hydraulics filled the cabin. The crew braced themselves as the Wellington's bombs were released, plunging silently toward the industrial heart below. The distant glow of furnaces reflected off the falling steel, a silent, deadly promise of destruction. Then, the sky erupted again. From the west, twin-engine silhouettes screamed toward them, confident in speed and firepower. Hargreaves swung the nose turret into position, while Dawes trained the dorsal guns with cold precision. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness like fiery ribbons, arcing toward the incoming night fighters. But once again, the inexplicable phenomenon struck. One BF 110, approaching too close, shuddered violently. Sparks erupted along the fuselage, smoke curling from the engines. The aircraft groaned, twisted, and then disintegrated in a fiery explosion. The shockwave rattled the Wellington, shaking instruments and throwing papers into the air. "Keep it together," Chambers barked. "They won't stop coming, but neither will we." Below, the factories continued to glow. But for the Luftwaffe pilots, the night had become a nightmare. Each wave of attackers, arrogant and overconfident, was being torn apart by a mixture of technology and sheer, improbable luck. The Wellington's electronic countermeasures, improvised and untested just months before, had become the invisible predators of the night sky. Grant, the navigator, called out the next waypoint, guiding them safely past concentrated flak zones. "Almost there, Hank," eyes peeled. A sudden flicker caught Hargreaves's eye. Another BF 110, diving at high speed from the clouds above, seemed determined to make its mark. He fired instinctively. Tracers streaked upward, narrowly missing the intruder. Then, as if the night itself had intervened, the fighter's port engine burst into flames, followed by a violent mid-air explosion. Shards of metal rained toward the Ruhr, illuminating the night like falling stars. The crew exhaled collectively, tension easing slightly, but never disappearing. Hank wiped soot from his goggles, heart pounding, realizing the truth. The Germans had underestimated them. They had laughed at these slow Wellingtons. But now, every pilot knew the truth. These bombers were lethal, unpredictable, and nearly unstoppable. Outside, the cold night wind whipped across the fuselage, carrying the distant cries of sirens and the smell of smoke. The Ruhr had been scarred, but the Wellingtons had survived. And as the crew prepared for their return flight, one thought lingered above all else. Tonight, they had rewritten the rules of war in the darkness above Germany. February 16th, 1943, 2,100 feet. The Ruhr was fading behind them, a patchwork of fires and shadows, smoke curling into the night sky like a slow black tide. Hank Chambers guided the Wellington northward, engine steady, each vibration a reminder of the thin line between survival and catastrophe. The air was frigid. Frost coated the wings, glittering faintly in the intermittent flashes from distant explosions. The crew exhaled slowly, tension giving way to a muted euphoria. Hargreaves's hands rested lightly on the turret, though his eyes still darted to every shadow, every flicker of light. Dawes, normally stoic, allowed himself a short, incredulous laugh. 6 down tonight, maybe more. No shots fired directly at them. They just blew up. His words hung in the cabin, a mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. Grant adjusted the navigational charts, guiding them through the maze of anti-aircraft fire zones and into safer corridors. "We're clear of the Ruhr," he said quietly. "Time to get home." Hank allowed himself a brief smile, thinking of Liverpool, of Mary, of the world beyond the cold night sky. The mission had been a gamble. Every sortie over Germany carried the certainty of death. But tonight, the Wellingtons had proven that courage, ingenuity, and a little luck could bend fate. Yet, beneath the relief, a darker realization lingered. These explosions, the mysterious, silent deaths of German night fighters, were not random. They were a harbinger of a new kind of warfare, one where technology could strike with invisible precision, where arrogance could be punished without warning. And for the Luftwaffe pilots, each mission over the Ruhr was no longer a test of skill. It was a game of survival against forces they could neither see nor predict. Hours later, as the first hints of dawn broke over the North Sea, the Wellington touched down at RAF Wellington. Exhausted but exhilarated, the crew climbed out into the biting cold, faces streaked with soot and sweat. Mechanics hurried to inspect the aircraft, shaking their heads at the minor damage sustained in a night that had claimed so many adversaries. Hank lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, letting the smoke mingle with the cold morning air. "Flying coffins," he muttered, glancing at his crew. "Maybe. But tonight, we were ghosts, hunters in the night." The mission would go down in squadron history. Reports would be filed, tales of German fighters exploding midair would spread through RAF intelligence, and the legend of the Wellington's hidden lethality would grow. But for those who had flown it, it was personal. Every explosion in the night had been a heartbeat of survival, a testament to skill, courage, and the uncanny, almost supernatural edge that the Wellingtons had brought to the sky. And as the sun crested the horizon, painting the frost-covered airfield in pale gold, Hank knew one truth above all. The Wellingtons had not just survived, they had changed the game, and the Luftwaffe would never forget it. February 17th, 1943, RAF Wellington. Dawn had broken fully, washing the airfield in pale light that failed to warm the chilled crews. Mechanics bustled around the Wellingtons, checking engines, hydraulic systems, and the bomb bays for damage. The aircraft looked almost serene now, its battered exterior hiding the deadly night it had just survived. Inside the mess hall, Hank and his crew gathered silently, nursing mugs of scalding tea. The adrenaline of combat still thrummed in their veins, hearts racing in quiet unison. For a moment, there were no jokes, no chatter, just a shared understanding of the night's events. Each man knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The slow, unassuming Wellington had become a specter of destruction, and the Luftwaffe's arrogance had been its undoing. Hargreaves broke the silence. You know, they laughed at us, called us easy targets, flying coffins. And yet, every time they came, they didn't just get shot at. They exploded. His voice was a mix of disbelief and awe. Dawes nodded. Electronic countermeasures, defensive gunners, maybe a little luck. But damn, it felt like the night itself was on our side. Hank allowed himself a small smile. He thought of Mary, of the life waiting back in Liverpool, and the uncertainty of returning from every mission. It's more than luck, he said, quietly. It's strategy. We adapted, we survived, and we turned their confidence into chaos. Meanwhile, intelligence officers pored over reconnaissance photos and post-mission reports. Patterns were emerging. Midair explosions had become a recurring phenomenon, and the Luftwaffe could not explain it. Reports filtered back to Berlin, causing whispers of panic among night fighter squadrons. No pilot wanted to fly near a Wellington again, not without fear of the mysterious, unseen threat. For the RAF crews, the consequences were personal as well as strategic. Each mission reinforced bonds forged in terror, trust earned in fire. They had learned to rely on each other and on the aircraft that many had once doubted. Every surviving Wellington was a triumph. Every destroyed enemy a grim confirmation of their ingenuity and bravery. As the sun climbed higher, melting frost from the airfield, Hank looked out toward the horizon. He thought of the next mission, of the countless nights still to come. But in this quiet dawn, he allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The Wellingtons had flown, and in doing so, they had rewritten the rules of the night. Above all, the lesson was clear. In war, arrogance is fatal, and even the slowest, most underestimated machine can become the deadliest predator when wielded with skill, courage, and determination. March 1943. Weeks had passed since the fateful night over the Ruhr, but the story of exploding German night fighters had already begun to ripple through the Luftwaffe and the RAF alike. In briefing rooms across England, intelligence officers pieced together accounts from multiple squadrons. Each report told the same astonishing tale. Wellingtons, slow and unassuming, were turning the night into a death trap for their pursuers. Hank Chambers and his crew were summoned to debrief. The officers asked detailed questions: altitudes, speeds, evasive maneuvers, enemy sightings, and the precise timing of the explosions. Hank answered carefully, describing defensive gun positions, radar countermeasures, and the strange phenomenon that seemed to incapacitate enemy aircraft at midair. "You realize," said one intelligence officer, leaning over the map of the Ruhr, "that what you experienced, this is unprecedented. Pilots have reported midair disintegrations before, but never with such consistency. The Germans, they don't understand it." Hargreaves exchanged a glance with Dawes. "Neither did we," he admitted. "All we knew was that we had to survive, and that somehow the night itself was helping." Outside, the Wellingtons were readied for their next sorties. Each crew member carried a quiet confidence, a knowledge born from experience. The aircraft's reputation had changed. Mockery had turned to caution, fear, and ultimately respect. The Luftwaffe began to adapt, flying higher, avoiding lone intercepts, and relying on more coordinated attacks. But the legend had already taken hold. Hank looked up at the sky that night, the fading light painting the clouds in shades of orange and gray. He could almost see the spirits of the lost German pilots, once confident, now wary. Each night flight was no longer just a mission. It was a contest of wills, a psychological chess game played at 20,000 feet. In letters home, he described the surreal nature of their missions. It's as if the aircraft itself has a mind. We fly, and the enemy falls. Not by skill alone, but by some strange, invisible hand guiding the night. You'd never believe it if I told you. The legend of the Wellington bomber grew. For the RAF crews, it was a source of pride and morale. For the Luftwaffe, it became a nightmare, a cautionary tale of underestimating the slow, the overlooked, and the persistent. And in the frozen night skies over Germany, the silent battles continued. Wellingtons glided, engines thrumming, turrets scanning, electronic warfare humming invisibly. Each sortie became a theater of suspense, courage, and deadly innovation. Hank Chambers and his crew knew they had survived something extraordinary, and that their actions had left an indelible mark on the history of aerial warfare. April 1943. The Ruhr was no longer just a patchwork of factories and smoke. It had become a symbol, a stage upon which the Wellingtons' legend played out night after night. German night fighter units had been ordered to change tactics, to approach with extreme caution, and yet the mid-air explosions continued. Pilots whispered in fear, mechanics shook their heads at reports that defied all engineering logic. The RAF crews, meanwhile, flew with a mix of grim determination and disbelief. Hank Chambers climbed into the Wellington once more, the cockpit smelling faintly of oil, sweat, and cold metal. He could hear the familiar hum of the Bristol Pegasus engines, vibrations coursing through his body like a pulse. His crew moved into position around him. Hargreaves in the nose turret, Dawes in the dorsal, Grant plotting their path through the darkened Ruhr. Each man knew the stakes. Each man carried the invisible weight of those who had fallen before. The night sky was thick with clouds, the faint glow of industrial fires barely piercing the darkness. Suddenly, distant searchlights stabbed upward, and Hank could see the faint silhouettes of twin-engine fighters approaching from above. The familiar dread set in, but it was now tempered by experience. He knew what the Wellington could do, and he knew the night held secrets the Germans could not anticipate. As the enemy closed, Hargreaves opened fire. Tracer rounds lit the night, weaving intricate patterns around the bomber as the night fighters twisted in response. And then, without warning, another Bf-110 erupted in flames, shattering into pieces that tumbled toward the Ruhr below. The crew exhaled in unison, hearts pounding. Dawes muttered quietly, "It's like the night itself is defending us." Hank nodded, hands steady on the control column. The Wellingtons had become more than machines. They were vessels of survival, instruments of fear, and carriers of a legend that spread faster than any propaganda. Pilots who had once mocked them now avoided them at all costs. Each sortie reinforced the strange, deadly rhythm. The hunter had become the hunted, and the night was their ally. By the time the bombs had been released and the aircraft began its return flight, the Ruhr lay beneath them scarred, but untouched in spirit. Each explosion, each destroyed enemy fighter, carried lessons for both sides. For the RAF, it was proof of ingenuity, bravery, and the deadly precision of teamwork. For the Luftwaffe, it was a humbling reminder of underestimation, arrogance, and the invisible perils that now haunted every mission over Germany. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting frost and smoke in pale gold, Hank allowed himself a rare smile. The mission had been another success, another night in which the Wellingtons' legend grew. And though the war would rage on, he knew this. In the cold, silent nights over Germany, the Wellingtons would always be more than mere bombers. They were ghosts, hunters, and symbols of unstoppable resolve. May 1943. Months had passed since that first night over the Ruhr, but the stories of exploding German night fighters had become a cornerstone of RAF lore. Wellingtons were no longer dismissed as slow, lumbering aircraft. They had earned a reputation as deadly predators of the night sky. Squadron intelligence reports meticulously recorded every encounter, altitudes, speeds, countermeasure deployments, and the eerie mid-air disintegrations of enemy planes. Hank Chambers sat in the briefing room at Wellington, watching new crews being trained. He traced the flight paths on the map with his finger, recounting tactics, evasive maneuvers, and the subtle electronic measures that had made their bombers so lethal. Young pilots listened with rapt attention, eyes wide at the stories of invisible deaths and seemingly supernatural interventions. The Luftwaffe laughed at us once, Hank said, voice calm but firm. They thought we were slow, fragile, and easy to destroy. And yet, time and again, they've learned otherwise. Never underestimate the unseen, and never underestimate a crew that refuses to die quietly. Outside, the Wellingtons stood ready on frost-covered runways, engines purring softly. Each aircraft carried the ghosts of its victories, the memory of the night fighters torn apart in the darkness above Germany. Pilots, gunners, and navigators alike understood the significance. They were not just flying bombers. They were instruments of fear, skill, and deadly innovation. In Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence scrambled to explain the phenomenon. Pilots spoke in hushed tones, mechanics reviewed flawed designs, and officers questioned the limits of their technology. The Wellingtons had rewritten the rules of night combat. What had begun as simple ridicule had ended in terror, and the RAF crews had forged a legend that would endure long after the war. For Hank and his men, the lessons were personal as well as professional. Courage, precision, and teamwork had turned a vulnerable bomber into a deadly weapon. The night sky had become both a battlefield and a classroom, teaching them that survival often depended on ingenuity as much as firepower. As the sun rose over the airfield, casting long shadows across the frost-glittering tarmac, Hank Chambers allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The Wellingtons had survived, and in doing so, they had changed the game. German night fighters would remember the terror of their mid-air explosions for years to come. And the RAF crews, ghosts of the night, would carry the knowledge that even in the cold, black skies above enemy territory, courage, skill, and innovation could turn the tide, one mission, one bomber, one legend at a time.